The Chosen is often seen as one of the places that symbolizes the Cold War. This region was ruled by Japan for a long time after the Korea under Japanese rule.
To govern, Japan established an institution called the Government General of Korea.
Japan conducted politics on the Chosen through the office of the Governor General. The development policy at the time was to make the North the center of heavy industry. The South became the center of agriculture and small and medium-sized industries. In this way, each region had its own distinctive characteristics. As a result, by the end of World War II, a large imbalance had developed in the economic foundations of the Chosen between North and South Korea. It was becoming unbalanced. Thus, the Chosen was liberated with the end of the war and Japan's defeat. This liberation was influenced by the victory of the Allied powers, including the United States and the Soviet Union. Therefore, the big question that arose in Chosen after liberation was who would lead Chosen and how. Chosen independence activists then decided to establish a new nation and set up the Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence. The founding of the People's Republic of Korea was then declared by this Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence for the founding of the People's Republic of Korea. However, it was the United States and the Soviet Union that did not approve of these actions by the Chosen side. Both countries did not accept the voices of the independence activists and did not recognize the new state declared by the Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence. After negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union, the Soviet Army occupied the north side of the 38th parallel north, while the American Army occupied the south side. We have decided on such a policy. Thus, the Chosen was divided. In the northern part of the Chosen, an industrial base centered on heavy industry remained. The economic situation on the northern side of the Chosen has become relatively favorable. The southern part of the Chosen had an agricultural-centered economic structure, and the post-war chaos led to serious inflation and food shortages. The southern part of the Chosen was forced into a situation where it had no choice but to rely on support from the United States. In this situation, the question arose as to how to handle the Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence. In this respect, the United States and the Soviet Union took contrasting approaches. The Soviet Union adopted a policy of utilizing the Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence formed by Chosen and the People's Committee that had spread throughout the country in occupation rule. The Soviet Union was not adequately prepared for the occupation of Chosen. This was because they decided that governing would be smoother if they based it on the chosen organizations of the Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence and the People's Committee. In the northern part of the Chosen, the Soviet civil administration provided guidance and supervision to chosen organizations. The country adopted a system of indirect rule in which chosen organizations were responsible for local administration. The United States did not recognize the organization created by the Chosen as an official governing body. The U.S. has adopted a policy of dismantling them. This is because the United States decided that it would be easier to govern by utilizing the administrative system created by Japan for the time being. In the southern part of the Chosen organizations such as the Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence lost their authority. The U.S. military government in Korea adopted a system of direct rule, with the government directly responsible for administration. As a result of these circumstances, the northern and southern parts of the Chosen ended up following separate paths. However, dissatisfaction with this political system was growing in the southern part of the Chosen. In the northern part of the Chosen, ethnic Chosen participate in politics. In the southern part of the Chosen cannot participate in politics. Such voices were widespread. Moreover, the administration of the southern part of the Chosen essentially inherited the system of the Government General of Korea. Naturally, this includes many bureaucrats known as the New Japan faction who cooperated with Japan during the war. In response to this situation, there are nationalists who believe that the Chosen people should take the lead in politics. There are anti-Japanese people who argue that the New Japan faction should be eliminated. There are communists who believe that American capitalism should not be accepted. Various forces came together to launch a general strike. This general strike resulted in the deaths of civilians as a result of police firing. This led to a surge of public discontent. Eventually, the general strike escalated into an abandonment of the people. The U.S. military government in Korea imposed martial law and began to suppress the rebellion. The U.S. military government in Korea, including the former Shin-Nihon faction, came into conflict with forces centered around nationalists and communists. The political structure of the South was taking shape. In this situation, the Soviet Union and the United States each focused on different individuals. There Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee. Kim Il-sung led a resistance movement against Japan in Manchuria during the war. Kim Il-sung later moved to Soviet territory and received Soviet support. At the end of the war, Kim Il-sung was stationed in a military camp within Soviet territory. Unlike Kim Il-sung, there are communists on the Chosen who continued to hide and be active within the country during the war. Some studied in Moscow and were sent there by the Comintern. In other words, there were multiple factions within the communists and no consensus. To sort the situation out, the Soviet Union united the communists in the north and established the Chosen branch of the Communist Party of Chosen. Once they were sure that the organization was in place, they brought Kim Il-sung before the citizens of Pyongyang and introduced him to the public as a hero of the anti-Japanese movement. Syngman Rhee is a distant relative of the Chosen royal family. During the war, Syngman Rhee continued to argue in the United States that American power was necessary for Chosen independence. However, there is no need for American power within Chosen. There are many forces within Chosen that believe they should achieve independence through their own efforts. Syngman Rhee's idea was simply to change the ruler from Japan to America. Syngman Rhee was criticized for wanting to sell the country to the United States. Syngman Rhee was not very popular at this time. Since the independence of the Chosen that was actually achieved was heavily dependent on American power, Syngman Rhee's reputation rose dramatically. Upon hearing the news of the end of the war, Syngman Rhee decided to return to the Chosen with the support of the United States. At the same time, a meeting between the foreign ministers of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union was taking place in Moscow. The topic of the meeting was post-war settlement around the world. The future direction of the Chosen is being discussed without any representatives from the Chosen Peninsula. At the time, the United States wanted to prevent the Soviet Union from expanding southward. The Soviet Union wanted to establish a government similar to its own to guarantee its security. The two sides had conflicting aims, making it difficult to reach a compromise. The ultimate goal is to establish a unified government in Chosen. To this end, the United States and the Soviet Union set up a joint committee. The United States then agreed to a policy of implementing trusteeship for up to 5 years. At this joint committee, the United States and the Soviet Union held discussions and confirmed their goal of establishing a unified and independent government within 5 years. However, both the United States and the Soviet Union wanted to keep Chosen within their spheres of influence. Both countries sought to establish independent, unified nations that would be effective for their own countries. In such a situation, even if a joint committee is established, no agreement will be reached. Chosen independence activists strongly opposed the agreement. The future of Chosen was decided without any Chosen present. They were furious that this agreement ignored the wishes of the Chosen people. People were more concerned about accepting trusteeship than about establishing a unity government. The Chosen was divided into those in favor of trusteeship and those opposed, resulting in fierce conflict. Political struggles, with demonstrations and clashes, erupt across the Chosen. At the same time, the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union was becoming increasingly serious. As a result, the Joint Committee established to discuss the future of the Chosen also came into conflict due to differences of opinion between the United States and the Soviet Union. I was in a position where I couldn't make any decisions. Finally, the United States decided that trusteeship was not possible. The United States decides to end negotiations with the Soviet Union. The United States has decided to bring the Chosen issue to the United Nations. The United Nations General Assembly decided through a US-led resolution to hold general elections in both North and South Korea under UN supervision. Naturally, the Soviet Union strongly opposed this. Because the South has a larger population, holding a unified election would put the North at a disadvantage. Therefore, the North insisted that no general elections would be held and refused to allow UN personnel to enter the North. As elections in the North were no longer possible, the UN decided to hold elections in the South alone. However, in the South as well, the war situation accelerated the division between North and South. Forces that were opposed to holding elections rejected the idea. As a result, forces seeking independence for the South alone came to hold a majority in parliament. However, the candidates who received the most votes were independent candidates who were not affiliated with any political party. The National Association for Korean Independence, which was considered to be Syngman Rhee's support base, ended up as the second largest party. As can be seen from this seat composition, it could hardly be said that Syngman Rhee had the support of the people at that time. However, it is true that members of parliament were elected in the South. With this composition of members, work will proceed on drafting a new constitution. Thus, the Dai convened and discussions on creating a constitution began. During this debate, Syngman Rhee strongly argued that the new country should adopt a presidential system. He maintained that attitude until the very end. This argument was ultimately accepted, and the new national system was adopted as a presidential system. However, at this stage, the president is chosen by a vote of members of parliament. The president's powers are limited by the National Assembly and he does not have great powers. Syngman Rhee was elected president in the election held by the National Assembly. The Republic of Korea, or South Korea, was officially declared. When South Korea declared its national independence in this way, the Chosen strongly opposed it. The Chosen has also officially implemented its constitution. The Chosen held elections based on its constitution and established the Supreme People's Assembly, a legislative body. The founding of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or Chosen, was then proclaimed with Kim Il-sung as Prime Minister.